everyone, it's Danielle from the BCO SciComm team, and welcome to the Black Rock Castle Observatory YouTube channel. This is a place where we post a lot of our activities that we do around the castle and some work that we do in the observatory as well. So if it's your first time here, first time joining us, don't forget to click that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our latest videos, as well as our future live streams. So today I'm joined by BCO's very own in-house astrophysicist, the man behind our telescope, Alan, who will be helping us sift through the physics of traveling through the universe today. And I also have my fellow SciComm team member, Rob, who has a background in biology and will be addressing the existence of life in the universe. And last but certainly not least, we have the founder of Cork Skeptics, Cullum, joining us today to weigh in on the cultural phenomenon behind today's topic, which is UFOs. I just want to remind everyone that if you're watching us from YouTube and you're on our channel, we have the live chat open. So please do submit your questions because we will be answering any comments or questions that you leave there during this live chat. So the reason that we're talking about this topic, the reason we're getting into UFOs today is because recently there was footage released by the US Pentagon that shows unidentified flying objects being recorded by Navy pilots during flight. So everyone here in the chat has seen that footage, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about what we think is going on there. Do you want to start it off?
Well, absolutely. Thanks, Danielle, and welcome to everyone to this particular chat. They were very interesting videos. My own background as an astronomer, I've dealt with a number of elements to do with foreground and background and near-Earth object phenomenon. So in particular, what we do is as a near-Earth object moves across the sky, we can track it. So it moves relative to the background. So we've an understanding of how these things move relative to background. So there's a number of elements that we may talk about later on, but the particular videos that the Pentagon themselves released were very interesting, but at the same time very explainable on a physics level. There's, for me, they're terrestrial objects. That's my opinion on it, and they're very explainable to be terrestrial objects. If you apply the correct science, the correct trigonometry, the correct background movement to them, then they are terrestrial objects.
When you say terrestrial, like what? Could you give an example? What you think?
Human-made.
Okay.
So whilst obviously they might be unidentified flying objects, which is important, unidentifying flight objects do technically exist, but they are simply unidentified flying objects. So as long as we can subsequently identify what they might likely are, and I think in this particular case that has been the case. So I mean, even if you look at the reports that were submitted by the Department of Defense, they even mention UAV and weather balloons and so on as the most likely cause of these things. So and the physics would support that. The physics would absolutely support that hypothesis. So I think whilst UFOs do exist, we're not talking about in this particular scenario. I don't think we can come to a conclusion that they're in any way, shape, or form extraterrestrial or anything like that.
And this was an important point, actually, with terminology. When we use the term UFO, it's not that it's necessarily a spacecraft driven by an alien. It's more that we can't identify what it is that we're looking at.
Well, absolutely, yes, and that's literally the definition of UFO. It's unidentified flying object. Right. So as long as we can identify what they are, then they are declassified as non-UFOs. So in this particular situation, then from the data that I can see, these are clearly identifiable objects that are, we may not know the exact transmitter number of object A or B, but they're clearly terrestrial, human-made objects.
It's interesting because there's definitely, I actually want to get into the cultural side of it and bring Colum in here, because there are a lot of reports of people having sightings and things, and they have real experiences seeing things in the sky. And I was reading Buzz Aldrin's book, and he's even talking about how they had an experience coming back from the moon, I believe, and they had some kind of object that they reported that they had seen. And it wasn't really talked about until they were on a press tour, and he just happened to mention it. Oh, we saw like a UFO coming back to Earth. And it was like this cultural explosion. This happened like, oh, NASA's trying to keep secrets, and they're trying to not about these things that are being cited by the astronauts, but because an astronaut came out and said that he had seen something, it gave it more credence to, and it gave it more, it made it more realistic. So have you have a bit of experience dealing with the maybe cultural side of and people's perceptions of UFOs, right?
Yeah, well, I suppose, I mean, when I was a kid, I was big into UFOs. I think most kids of my generation were. And, you know, I gobbled up all of the various different literature that was around there. I mean, this was the 70s, right? So UFOs were a really, really big thing back then. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what I think is kind of interesting, I think, about UFOs is that they seem to mirror the culture that was around, you know, in the 70s. They started off in the 1940s. There was, you know, reports of high moving planes, you know, around the same time as supersonic aircraft were becoming common. They moved on to, you know, much bigger kind of, you know, phenomenon. There was a bit of a peak around the 90s, you know, around when Independence Day was being created. People tend to, you know, these kind of phenomenon, people start to look up in the sky, and then they start seeing things maybe that they're not familiar with. But it goes back into the 1870s, when the first airships, the first dirigibles started to be created. There was people talking about, you know, these airships in the sky, and they always kind of match the technology that we have invented here on the Earth. And I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of it. It doesn't seem to be, they don't seem to lead culture. They don't seem to lead, you know, the zeitgeist, if you like, what's actually happening. They tend to respond to what's happening. And I think the interesting thing about what's going on now with the Pentagon cases is it's very much heavy on drones, you know. So a lot of the pictures that we see, you know, seem to indicate some sort of unmanned drone, which again might not have been what we would have seen in the 1970s, when people were talking more about, you know, what they'd seen and kind of ET and that kind of stuff. So I think there is a linkage there. You know, people get excited by what they see in the movies, they get excited by what they see in the news, and then they start seeing UFOs that seem to mirror that. And I think that's just an interesting aspect of it.
I think even at the observatory, there are certain times of year where we get more questions about UFOs, and it tends to, in my experience at the observatory, it tends to align with when Venus is in the sky or Jupiter, because those two are so bright in the night sky. And especially right now, Venus being very, very bright in the early evening, we tend to hear a lot more about, what is that? I saw a bright light in the sky, and it was brighter than anything I've ever seen before. And that's the kind of thing that we hear around the observatory.
I think there's also a confirmation bias to it. As Colum mentioned, you know, as a kid, he was deeply ingrained in all things UFO. So I suppose at a time like that, when you do see something in the sky, you're probably going to think UFO quicker than somebody who maybe isn't as readily engrossed in UFOs. I remember myself as a kid, I was a dinosaur nut. And I still, to this day, remember sitting at the kitchen table, and I saw a pteranodon fly by the window. And I was like, oh my God, Mom, a pteranodon is after flying by the window. That's not supposed to happen. They're 65 million years extinct. You need to get in touch with a museum right now. You know, so even as a kid, I was smart enough to know that it was a big deal that a pteranodon was showing up outside. You needed to get in touch with the museum about it. But I wasn't smart enough to know what a heron was. It was my first time seeing a heron. Because my brain was in that dinosaur space, I went straight to, it must be a dinosaur, rather than looking to a more reasonable explanation first. And I think there is a risk of that. If you want to see UFOs in the sky, you're going to see UFOs in the sky.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, we have a comment here too. If a little bit of a segue, I guess, into this is that having that physical evidence and the evidence from physics itself. Have Tree Monster here asking, could Alan explain more about the physics evidence for the objects being of terrestrial origin?
Sure. So if you actually look at how the so if we take Go Fast, right, which is the latter part of the 2015 Pentagon release or capture, but so it's the later the late stage video. If you look at that, for example, it looks like it's moving very quickly across water, for example. But if you actually do the physics behind it, so if you map the video itself, and you do a cross section of the pixels, for example, and you take into account what's called parallax, where the jet is actually the Navy jet that's moving is actually turning, banking. And when they do that, their cameras are on gimbals, which means they redirect automatically. Mm-hmm. So it looks like the image, like it's stationary, but if that camera didn't actually turn on a gimbal, then it would have been completely out of sight. So it's because of the nature of the hardware that the Navy have, but also of physics itself. And a very simple enough means of just testing parallax, for example, is if you stand and have someone else stand in front of you and put a picture frame behind them, right, and take 3 steps left and 3 steps right, you'll have 2 different versions of the same picture. But based on that, you can then do a calculation of how far away it is, but also how fast it's moving. So by doing that, and by analyzing the images, we've been able to calculate, for example, that particular object was well above sea level. It was approximately 14,000 feet, thereabout. It wasn't moving very fast at all, only in the tens of knots. So, 50 miles an hour maximum type thing. So it was in the upper atmosphere. It was much more than likely a high altitude balloon. Mm. So it may have appeared to have been moving quickly, but that's because of the nature of how the jet and the camera system on the jet were actually operating.
It's interesting. Because parallax is something that you use in astronomy as well to measure things in the universe and how fast they're moving and that kind of a thing. So it's an interesting to apply that to a simple, even just trying to figure out how fast something is moving in a video or something along.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do. We use parallax on a regular basis in astronomy to gauge distances to stellar objects and beyond. And it's quite a powerful technique. It's actually quite simple in its implementation because it's almost like it's a simple geometric element, but it's quite powerful when it's used correctly.
Yeah, and actually this is something I wanted to get into because since we're talking about having unidentified flying objects and possibly having them come from outside of Earth or outside of our solar system, and we talk about traveling across the universe, that there are a few issues with that in terms of how big the universe really is and how far we can actually go. And we've talked a little bit about this before. So in terms of having extraterrestrials visit us, what would that look like, or how could that be possible?
Well, from a physics point of view, so our nearest galactic neighbor is just over 4 light years away, approximately. We know it likely does have an extrasolar planet, but at the same time, it's unlikely to harbor life by the nature of the planet itself. Beyond that, you know, if you think about traveling at the speed of light, you know, the speed of light is, you know, 300,000 kilometers per second. It's quite difficult to do that. And well, technically not possible, but anyway, it's so it would, if we were to get there in any reasonable amount of time, we'd have to be traveling, as in, so if we take one generation of humans, okay, so if we don't want to go through generation after generation after generation of space travel, because that in and of itself creates problems genetically. I'll defer to my my biology colleague on that one, in terms of the hazards of the biology of space travel. But to get there in one generation, we'd have to manufacture a vessel that travels at 100 million miles an hour. Now, we can't do that. Currently, we can't do that. Maybe someone else has done that, but it's highly unlikely, because these are very incredible speeds, but they also have very significant biological impacts, I would have thought, as well.
Is that right, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, like, take the Voyager probe, for instance. That's currently the fastest object that we have created as humanity. And that was launched in, I think it was the late 70s. That only left the solar system, our solar system, 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That gives you an idea of the scale of, like, we're a technologically advanced species, how difficult it would be. So at those speeds, to get to our nearest neighbor would take somewhere in the region of 60 to 70,000 years. Right. That's a really long way to go if you're not sure that somebody's home. I mean, if I were an alien, I would at least send a text message first. It is much easier to beam a message to us and see if we're even there before sending a flying saucer halfway across the galaxy to go checking things out. And as Alan says, there are risks in terms of space flight and traveling, or at least as for life as we know it. For instance, very simple stuff like multi-generational ships. There's a fantastic podcast by someone called Rose Eveleth that looks at the possibility of something as simple as pregnancy in space. Mm-hmm. So even human pregnancy actually requires an element of gravity to help the fetus develop. So if you're in not a zero gravity environment, then you're saying, okay, we can't get there in one generation, we'll do it in 3 or 4. We don't know yet how we would actually overcome those problems with gravity. So any alien civilization is likely to mirror the same rules and laws of evolution that we see here on Earth. So these are huge problems they'd have to overcome as well. So again, you have to look at the likelihood that somebody has overcome those problems and decided to visit us without checking in first that we're even home. The odds are stacked against. I mean, the famous line in the X-Files is, "I want to believe," and I really do. I'm a Star Trek. I really want to believe that there's aliens out there, but the odds that they're visiting us are really stacked against me.
Well, it's fun when you're talking about multi-generational, having multi-generations on the same spacecraft. The signal here is saying, and babies can't fly spaceships. So that would be a problem. If everybody dies off and there's babies left, that's all we got. And the signal also asked, would it be more likely that we'd send some kind of probe? So I guess instead of sending us, sending something else that could survive.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, but no, again, that is an interesting question, because I was chatting with Al earlier, and he mentioned that the first thing that we started sending out into the universe was radio waves and TV signals. So if those are traveling at the speed of light, you got to figure, if we've been broadcasting for 100 years, for us to have any hope of hearing back today, the nearest neighbor that could have responded to us by now is at least somewhere in the region of 50,000 light years away. And there aren't a huge number of star systems within a particular radius for us to be dealing with. So it's a lot of empty space that we're shouting into, hoping to hear a shout back. And we need a lot of luck if there is somebody out there to have any hope of hearing back from them. So the same goes for a probe. I mean, if we did decide to send a probe, which of the billions of stars out there do we decide to fire a probe in the direction of, hoping that we'll find life? it's a tough question to answer. It's a real needle in a intergalactic haystack.
Maybe I might add something there. It's just it's the Fermi paradox, right? It's that kind of idea that you know, that there's nothing against the idea that the universe is full of aliens. And I think, you know, when early steps were being made to try and figure out what was going on in space, it wouldn't have been unreasonable for us to send out, you know, to have radio antennae, and then suddenly to realize that the universe is this massive rainforest of all of these exotic signals, and there was aliens communicating everywhere. But that's not what happened, at least to our knowledge. We've stuck, you know, there's been loads and loads of attempts to try and listen in on the universe, and they've all failed so far. And that's not a case of, you know, us, of the world kind of going, well, we don't want to believe aliens. It's actually trying to see if there's evidence of it. And so far it's been pretty much kind of silence, right? And the same thing kind of goes with UFOs as well, a little bit, which is that we've had 70 years now, more than 70 years of lots and lots of UFO reports and lots of commentary, including the videos that we've been talking about. And, you know, while they're interesting, they haven't necessarily met the standards of evidence. People are kind of going, look, hold on a second, loads of eyewitness reports, loads of blurry images in the night, loads of blurry videos, and people absolutely honest about what they've seen, and websites, and, you know, people really, really invested in this and really believing it. But when it comes to the standards of evidence, you know, we're kind of waiting for that. Alan, I think you were going to...
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across the column. I was actually going to absolutely 100% agree with you, in the sense that as a scientific community, we base ourselves on scientific evidence, and the evidence currently is simply not there. You know, we've as a community, we've been looking at this, and it's not that we don't want it to be there. We're simply looking at this with open eyes. You know, if it's there, it's there. If it isn't, it isn't. We're happy to engage or otherwise, irrespective. But the evidence is simply not there. You know, a lot more, the majority, if not all, of the phenomenon so far can be explained through other means. So until we get, you know, correlated evidence, as in evidence in more than one location, more than one sighting, with real, particularly scientific evidence of something existing, then it you know, it's hard to believe it, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, I think, has been that, like, what people have said is that, you know, there's problems that people have either been really specific about what they've seen. So they've come across aliens, or they've come across spacecraft, and, you know, it's been really, really vivid, but almost inevitably there's very, very little corroboration. And then you get other sightings which have been highly corroborated, but very, very unspecific. And, you know, usually they can be explained by maybe a meteor shower, or re-entry, or balloons, or a rocket launch, or whatever. What's the golden kind of, I suppose, the sweet spot is to have very, very specific corroborated evidence. So lots and lots of people see it, and it's really, really specific, and it then becomes very, very interesting to science. And I think a lot of what happens with UFOs is you get this gap, you know, the idea being that there are things that can't be fully explained necessarily by, you know, by the scientists or anybody who's looking at it, because maybe the reporting is bad, or maybe we just don't have enough information. So, you know, there's been a number of large scale investigations involving tens of thousands of different reports, and sometimes there's this like residue of reports at the end, like maybe 700 reports that can't fully be explained, because maybe there's not enough information around, or the eyewitness testimony was just a little bit too vague. And what that is sometimes seen as is, oh, well, there's 700 reports there, so it must be alien craft, or it must be new technologies that are being developed by the government that they don't want us to, it's essentially, it's kind of fit into that gap, your own idea. And that's not evidence. That's called, it's kind of an argument from ignorance. It's saying, we don't know, so therefore it must be, insert our own favorite belief.
Yeah, when in reality is we don't know. Therefore, one shouldn't actually jump to any conclusions. You can only jump to a conclusion when you do know. That's the very nature of the scientific process. So, and that's the very nature of where we have gone as a as a species and as a society. We all live around science every single day. These machines that we're using right in front of us to look at this particular broadcast, for example, wouldn't exist without science. So, we all do fundamentally believe in science, or adhere to science. So absolutely. I mean, I do think, jumping back to the weather balloons and so on, just for a second, I do think there are a number of phenomena that people might see on the odd occasion that might, depending on the time of day or night. And these could be Chinese lanterns, they could be meteorites, there's a whole host of other phenomenon.
Can I just interrupt and say that I look at the night sky all the time? Like, I'm out there any chance I can possibly get. And Chinese lanterns got me a couple weekends ago. I had my phone out there, I was recording. I'm like, I have to send this to Alan. I don't know what I'm looking at. And then I saw another one, and then I saw another one. And I was like, it's Chinese lanterns. And so it's deceiving. And I know what I'm looking at in the night sky. And I still thought, oh, look what I got here. I'm going to be famous.
Yeah, it happens. There are a number of objects that float around our atmosphere and external to our atmosphere. But if you apply the scientific logic to what you're looking at, and you analyze it, then you can come up with a reasonable explanation other than it's extraterrestrial human beings coming to, or extraterrestrial beings coming to visit us.
I think the scale of what we're dealing with is kind of lost on people too. I mean, as a zoologist and a biologist, I absolutely 100% believe there are aliens out there. I believe just the odds that we're the only hosting life, it's too ridiculous to assume that we are. Now, what's less ridiculous is to assume that we're one of the only, if not very, very few planets that are hosting intelligent alien life. Imagine there is another planet out there that is trying to check in on planet Earth, a planet that is absolutely littered with life, but remove humans from it. The whales aren't going to be able to, chat back. The hippos, the dolphins, the most intelligent species on the planet, still, after us, aren't space capable. They're not technologically advanced. They can't communicate. And the other thing that people don't seem to realize is just how insanely lucky we are to be here on the planet that, as far as we know, is the best suited to life. Multicellular organisms such as ourselves evolved from one single organism billions of years ago. We got lucky once on the planet that is most populous to life, and it led to all of us. So even in the system that is best primed for life, life as we know it only barely happened by a happy, lucky chance. So bacteria and some small multicellular organisms can happen for sure, given enough time. That seems entirely reasonable to me. But there was one event in our evolutionary history that still blows my mind. We had to acquire mitochondria to get bigger. And that involved a simple cell capturing another cell and then replicating such that these little cells became their battery source. It was the only way that you could engineer larger and larger cells, where the energetic cost of maintaining the big cell didn't exceed what the energy use was able to be to actually perform complex tasks after that point. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have large multicellular life on Earth. And that something that ridiculously specific has happened multiple times throughout the universe and has led to intelligent species that can actually man spacecraft as well, it's not impossible, but it is asking a lot to think that it's common.
As a matter of interest, Rob, given the number of, as an astrophysicist, given the number of planets that are likely to be out there, in the number of galaxies and the number of possibilities, you know, how likely do you actually think, you're talking trillions of planets, more than likely, if you do the multiplication in terms if you incorporate all the galaxies. So, you know, are we talking within our own galaxy, or are we talking extragalactic as well?
I mean, I don't know is the short answer, but I mean, all you're really looking at is repeating an experiment multiple times over. I mean, the elements that make us up here on Earth are present in pretty much the same quantities throughout the universe. So the experiment that is planet Earth has probably been replicated many, many times over. And for something to get lucky more than once, it's basically how many times can you roll the dice? I mean, I'm not really good at darts, but give me enough time and I'll probably hit the bullseye. The same is probably true of our universe. If enough planets out there have the conditions that are suitable for life, life will probably evolve. If enough of those can then have the systems needed for complex life, there's probably more complex life on them. And of those, there's probably a few that have, you know, advanced life with technology and the ability to travel out outer space. The problem is, what are the odds that they found us or vice versa and then knew how to locate each other in such a vast expanse of unlikely occurrences? It just doesn't look good for anybody that thinks we're being very specifically visited by people.
I just wanted to jump in because one of the comments here from John O'Sullivan was saying, from the SETI point of view, an advanced alien species who has not developed radio, say some sort of like fiber optics, the planet itself would be dark to us. So even if they did have an advanced civilization, but just didn't have radio, we wouldn't even know they were there anyways. I just want to say that because it just.
That's an interesting point, Danielle. I mean, I'd be slightly surprised, based on what we know with our civilization, that if they developed fiber optics, that they wouldn't have radio capability. It's possible, absolutely, but I would have thought a bit unlikely based on what we know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it brings up an interesting point that Rob mentioned earlier. You know, we've been broadcasting ballpark 100 years in terms of radio waves, and many of them do leave our atmosphere and have left our atmosphere for the last 100 years. So we have basically a sphere of 100 light years, where planets within that diameter could have heard our particular radio signal. Whether the signal to noise is strong enough, that's another, you know, it depends, and that gets into very complex physics. But let's just say, for argument's sake, it's a strong signal. So at the very maximum, it's within 100 light years that we have a maximum diameter of extrasolar planets that could have heard our signals. Now, there's not that many planets within that sphere. There's a few, absolutely, but it's not that many. So the likelihood of them, if there's another intelligent species within that sphere, then that would be particularly interesting, I would have thought.
Well, just wait. Sorry, Colin, I was just thinking, just wait until they start picking up our, like, because obviously we're broadcasting television signals as well, and radio and all that's going out there. So they're going to be picking up our Love Island broadcasts and our Tiger King and all. They're not even going to want to come over here. That planet's crazy.
And one of the things that you know, the common, again, the cultural view of what an alien looks like is very interesting, because essentially they have these big bulbous eyes and, you know, kind of you know, almost kind of childlike features. You know, they've got this kind of gracile look about them, which is the same body feature as a fish. you know, like as a human face, right? Mainly humanoid. But if you go back kind of evolutionary, it goes all the way back to fish, right? Dinosaurs and, you know, mammals, we all kind of share that same feature. But if you go back a bit further, then they get a bit weird, you know. But why is it that this common view of what an alien looks like is actually really humanoid? It seems kind of to defy odds, because even on our own planet, we have so many different body forms. And that's, you know, I mean, as Rob was saying, that you could multiply that by a billion, you know, looking at various different other kind of, you know, potential worlds. I don't know, Rob, what you think of that?
Well, what's interesting is zoologists and astrobiologists and people like this, if they knew what a system was like, could likely make reasonable enough predictions about what life on the planet might look like. So for instance, Charles Darwin discovered I can't remember exactly what the species was, but he discovered a type of orchid. And while studying it, he realized that for it to be pollinated, there was this incredibly narrow tube that you had to reach down to reach the nectar. And he's like, if this thing is getting pollinated by insects in the wild, it is getting pollinated by an insect that has an absolutely ridiculously long tongue. And sure enough, years later, they discovered the ridiculously long tongue moth that Charles Darwin had predicted. Same goes for a species in a particular habitat. Now, if I go to a jungle environment and look up into the trees, I'm not expecting to see something the color of a camel. I'm expecting to see something that's green because it will be camouflaged depending on what part of the food chain it occupies. You're going to expect certain features. And perhaps the best example of this is convergent evolution, where two distant groups, sometimes not even at all related species, converge on the exact same body form because they're presented with the same environmental challenges. So if you, anybody at home, I'd encourage you to look up images of a green tree python and an emerald tree boa. They're two completely distantly related species. One is from South America, the other is from Australia. They look exactly the same because the environment shaped them. The environment dictated what the best body form would be. And so we could look at a distant planet and say, okay, this is what the atmosphere is like. This is what habitats that the creatures are living within look like. If it's really cold, we have a pretty good probability that it will either be very furry or will have heavy fat deposits. You know, you can start speculating a lot more than you might think. And one of the areas in our own backyard, essentially, where we think we might find life are on icy moons. So places like Europa or even on Titan. And one of the speculations is that if these things host hydrothermal events, that they might host life similar to the kind of life that we find at our own hydrothermal events. So, you know, things like jellyfish or worms and things with that kind of a shape. Obviously, we can't get too specific because we don't know what the evolutionary history of the planet is, but I wouldn't be surprised, I'd be delighted, but I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out a few years from now that we found some kind of life form on Europa that looks something like a jellyfish or a little bacteria. But back to John's question, just to divulge a little, he asked about if a species hadn't developed the right technology that they'd effectively be dark to us. Not entirely true. So for instance, we changed our atmosphere right around the time of the Industrial Revolution. So if, as scientists, we can actually look at the light coming, passing through the atmosphere of a planet, analyze the atmosphere of the planet. So if a society suddenly became industrialized, we could actually track changes in its environment and see, okay, all of a sudden there's an awful lot of hydrocarbons. There's probably some industrialization going on there, or that it's a probable explanation for what we're looking at. So you can detect sources of life other than technology, potentially.
Well, absolutely, Rob. I was going to mention the fact that but the well, actually a number of agencies, European Southern Observatory, European Space Agency, NASA, so on, they're all building and coming together on some levels to build a suite of telescopes to look at multi-color, multi-frequency angles of extrasolar planet systems. And yes, the whole intention is to actually monitor what exactly the atmosphere of that planet is. So that will then allow the likes of astrobiologists to start to think and consider, yeah, okay, that could come from this type of animal or that type of animal, or is there any type of life form in it at all? Is it microbial only, for example? Does it have the ability to host life in the first instance? And obviously we're very keen on looking at planets that are in the Goldilocks zone. So the zone that it's not too hot, not too cold. It's right in that particular sweet spot at its distance from its parent star, that it can potentially hold life. And it's Earth-like in size, maybe sometimes slightly smaller, sometimes slightly larger, but as long as it's within 2 to 3 to 4 times the size of Earth, it's possible to hold Earth-like people. We do this, by the way, because of our own system, our own experience. We know that we have an Earth and it has been able to generate life. So you use that as the foundation. And then what you do is you take that and you start looking for that. Is it possible for the likes of Jupiter's and massive planets or tiny planets to host life? Is it possible? Who knows? Possibly. Very unlikely, but possible.
The reality is extremophiles, like life is remarkably resilient, as we're finding with the virus, right?
Yep.
As an example, there's so many different types of life, and some forms of life, as we've seen with kind of extremophiles and animals that live, or creatures that live near hot springs and the likes. They're living in extreme environments. So, it's not beyond, imagination that someplace like, Jupiter, which is a very, very, an intense weather system, to say the least, in a very, very intense area, there might not be something like that, or some other planets. So you can look for life anywhere in the solar system, I suppose.
And the other thing to be fair about, as Alan pointed out, is that all we can really do is look for analogs of what our particular experience is, and that's carbon-based life forms. But there is potentially other types of life out there. We've hypothesized that silicon-based life forms might exist. Silicon and carbon are functionally similar enough. So hypothetically, a silicon-based life form might exist. We don't know how that would change their adaptivity and how susceptible they are to different environments. One of my favorite examples from science fiction of something like this is in Star Trek. So Vulcans bleed green blood because where we have iron in our blood, they have copper, because copper is functionally similar to iron and it performs basically the same idea. So it's kind of a fun thing to think about how different elements could change our perception of what life is. So we could be looking at areas, looking for signals and signs of life as we know it, and missing signs of an entirely different type of life that we just, as of yet, are unaware of.
Can I piggyback off of that? Because actually Ted from the Astro Club, he actually asked how many different species from fauna and flora have ever lived on Earth? How long did it take from bacteria to moon landing for all of that to exist?
Well, if I remember correctly, the first life form appeared 3.5 billion years ago. The vast majority of life forms that ever existed have gone extinct. So again, that doesn't actually lend itself too well to the idea that there is life throughout the galaxy. Even the most hospitable planet in our solar system to life is doing its best to kill it off. I don't know. It is an astronomical figure in terms of the number of life forms that have inhabited Earth. There have been kind of punctuated equilibriums. There's been sudden explosions like the Precambrian explosion. Once the eukaryotic species got the mitochondria, it definitely lended itself well to diversification of shapes and forms. Speaking of actually the history of life on Earth, that's another interesting one for being able to detect life elsewhere. the oxygen composition of the early Earth was incredibly different to the current oxygen composition. And it was dramatically changed by something as a photosynthesizing bacteria. So for a very long time, most life on Earth was actually anaerobic. It didn't like oxygen. Oxygen was a poison. Then these photosynthesizing bacteria came along, started releasing more and more oxygen as a waste product. The oxygen composition in the atmosphere shot up, and then it forced other creatures to either have to adapt or move to anaerobic environments. But in that case, you have life on Earth that would probably be detectable from a similar Earth-like planet analyzing our atmosphere. And that life was purely multicellular or single cellular, which is kind of crazy to think about. Something as simple as a single-celled organism can change the composition of the planet's atmosphere.
Sorry, Rob, would that have been? Would that be captured in the ice core samples that they take in the Arctic and Antarctic and so on? Would that type of composition be analyzed using those?
Not in ice cores, because the ice cores would be closer to the scales of hundreds of thousands of years. But you'll see atmospheric changes over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. That's how we know that the release of greenhouse gases, for example, has spiked in our lifetime. Because we can look at the cycles of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and see for sure through ice cores that, yes, we have driven up the composition of our greenhouse gases. But the early composition of oxygen, I'm going to be honest, I don't exactly know the means that they used to determine what the early composition were, but I know that even fossilized bacteria can give some indication of what kind of species would have been present early on in our evolutionary history.
So given that we have so many different types of species on the planet, but out of all of that time and all of the different types of species we have, only one has been able to actually build a rocket and then go into space. So if we're looking at other planets, I mean, even within our own solar system, we're pretty certain there are no civilizations hiding on moons or planets somewhere in our own solar system. So it's pretty safe to say in our own backyard, we don't have an industrialized civilization out there other than ourselves. So what are the chances of us finding something close by that we not only can communicate to, but that has actually been able to develop to a point where it could build a spaceship and actually visit us?
Well, if you look at the numbers, so the fact that we've had a number of telescopes looking upwards, the likes of SETI, but not just SETI. We've hundreds and hundreds of radio telescopes pointing upwards, and optical telescopes, obviously. But radio is possibly a slightly easier means of doing it because of it's an easier means of actually sending signals around the world, around a planet. And thus far, we've never detected a signal that we can verify as being extraterrestrial. So if you consider that we're looking in, again, I'll go back to, it may not be 100 years because it'll be slightly less than that, but maybe 75 years of radio telescopes pointing upwards, and maybe 50 years in terms of the bigger telescopes, radio telescopes pointing upwards. Then is there anything within a 50-year diameter? Well, if they are, they're not broadcasting in any form of radio signal that we're aware of. They may be broadcasting in other signals, but they're not broadcasting in radio.
I think the problem sometimes is even if we did find some, by stroke of luck, you found some sort of multicellular creature that had pretty much done the same thing, discovered radio waves and was a spacefaring or space, interested in outer space. How do you communicate with them? I mean, that's one of the really fascinating questions because, we have problems communicating with our cats, right? I mean, right. They're, or even our closest relative, like chimpanzees or whatever, what I mean? There's real difficulties in communicating to those animals, and how you develop a language that, covers such a huge distance and allows you to communicate who you're about, and that they would understand it. I mean, like, the challenges are enormous.
And more important probably than how do you do it is, should you? I mean, if there is a species out there that can listen to us and understand us quickly, they're probably smarter than we are. And traditionally, when you introduce a new life form into a novel system here on Earth, it hasn't gone well. So right around the time that the supposed Roswell crash happened in New Mexico, there was a crash in Guam where some military shrapnel was chucked onto the island of Guam that had brown tree snakes in it. These brown tree snakes have overrun the island and ruined it. They've killed off all the native birds. They've started eating all the native people's poultry. They've started taking out power lines. They have been unable to eradicate this snake from the island. They've taken to the point where they're dropping poisoned mice from helicopters to try and get rid of these things. But they've been there for well over 50 years. They're still at a density of about 3,000 per square mile. So, I mean, you could airdrop Samuel L. Jackson and St. Patrick onto the island. You're not getting rid of these snakes. Do we want to invite aliens to our backyard who may, react in a similar way to the brown tree snake when they got to Guam?
So if I can be more optimistic than pessimistic for a second, Rob, I would hope that in the scenario, for example, the likes of us as a species, as we continue to do our exploration of the universe, with the lunar village, and hopefully an excursion to Mars and so on in the next number of years, that we'll do it in an appropriate manner, but without any intention of harming any of the landscape that were there. So, I think when you get to that level, one would hope that if an alien species did exist and did happen to come towards us, and manage to get towards us, even though the physics isn't in their favor, then one would hope that they wouldn't necessarily be hostile towards us. I would hope.
One of the things is, in terms of UFOs, it's not always aliens. It's not necessarily the UFO community is kind of saying, hey, there's aliens out there. There seems to be quite a lot of quite skeptical people in that community who are saying, actually, it's not really aliens. It's governments. It's local. It's the governments have come up with these new technologies, and they don't want to show people what they are. And that's actually something that I think has changed even in the last couple of decades, where people were actively talking about aliens and alien visitations and stuff like that. And it now has become a little bit more conspiratorial, and it's a little bit more about governments having these technologies, and particularly again going back to the video, there's this kind of idea, that's not an alien, it's gone past me, that there's technologies that have not been released, like going from 0 to 500,000 kph in a second, that kind of idea, which is kind of, I suppose that's again, it's the cultural kind of thing around this. It's not necessarily always, it's about what do we know, but there's this thing is, it's the same issue. If the laws of physics are being broken here, if there's this rapid acceleration from 0 to 500,000 miles an hour or whatever, and there's no sonic boom, you're still going, okay, we still need to be skeptical.
Absolutely, absolutely, Colm, and you're right in there. Maybe a portion of the increase, as you mentioned previously, in the 90s, because that was around the time that a lot of, for example, drone technology was being developed. And we've only seen it come into mainstream life in the last number of years, but the drone technology itself was being developed in the 90s. Military drones take off extremely quickly. So, there could be a perception of I could see where there might be a misunderstanding of what the actual craft itself was, because they're not quite the same size as an aircraft, for example. As in, like, let's say a Boeing or an Airbus or something like that. They're not that size, but at the same time, they move very rapidly. So I could certainly understand how there might be misinterpretation of what's going on. And then obviously you have the quadcopters and the octocopters and all that kind of stuff started to come along. You could, they zip about quite handily as well, by the way. They're pretty fast moving vehicles. So I could certainly understand, there could certainly, in a more modern era, there could be misconceived or misconceptions or misunderstandings about the very nature of the technology that they're looking at. Especially with depth perception, like a big, like if you look at some of the larger octocopter drones, the ones with the larger number of rotations, like some of them are they can be 5 to 10 kgs in size. These are big beasts. Like they're half the size of a car. Some of them, in that sense. So, but if they're far enough away and they're moving about left and right like that, they're panning left and right, they could completely be perceived as, whoa, what's going on here? So you're right in that sense. Yep.
The conspiracy of deliberate government misinformation is actually one that it's reasonable to give sympathy to. I mean, when we look to the past, we have seen governments do some shaky X-Files type shenanigans, like MK Ultra, for example. Like people were unwillingly given large amounts of LSD and tested without their knowledge. But perhaps my favorite, though, is I think it was World War II. Correct me if I'm wrong. To this day, we believe that carrots give night vision because a deliberate campaign of government misinformation decided to mask the fact that radar was giving them really good advantages at nighttime by pretending that they were just feeding their pilots tons of carrots and that they had better eyesight than the opposition did, and that's why they were able to hit targets at night. So to cover up for a new technology, radar, we convinced everybody the reason that we were nailing targets at night was we were eating lots of carrots, to the point that the enemy started chipping in tons and tons of carrots. And that misinformation has persisted to this day. So, I mean, it is a viewpoint I have some sympathy for, to be frank.
It's a viewpoint. I think the thing about conspiracy is overused. It seems to be like a conspiratorial thinking allows somebody who knows absolutely nothing to have a debate with an expert. Because there's this kind of, well, you're telling a lie. It's all a big lie, and I'm kind of trying to expose the lie. And that's the problem with conspiracy theory. It's overused. As soon as somebody gets into a difficulty about, ooh, I'm not really sure what's going on, or my personal kind of view of the whole universe has been challenged and it's been shown to be wrong or whatever, rather than kind of saying, hey, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I need to kind of revise my assumptions here. Conspiracy is used instead. So in other words, it's all big dark forces shaping it, and they basically manipulate and that's, I think it's just that once you go down that road, then you continue to keep on using that excuse when you come up against roadblocks, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper into this whole phenomenon of conspiracy, which I think is really not good, right? It's not a very healthy place to be in, trying to continuously think of other forces trying to view things as wrong. And I think one of the things about UFOs is that it's often about, the reality, I think for most of the scientific community, is that they don't have the evidence. So they're kind of pushing back because they're saying the evidence is not good enough. And the true believers are saying, well, you're all part of this big conspiracy, and you're saying this because you're in it some way, or you're kind of believing that, that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of looking at it is to say, look, come on, once we have proper evidence for UFOs, maybe we can do something about it. But right now, you're not giving us enough, and don't be going down the conspiracy route all the time. Start please engaging with the evidence a little bit more, and maybe we'll get somewhere. I think one of the things that that what has happened is that governments run out of steam, from what I can see. There's been these investigations of UFOs, and then over a period of time, there's just not enough to go on, and they close up. And then there's another person somewhere saying, yeah, we need to look at this, and another investigation starts off, and then over a couple of years, that closes up. And people are saying it's a big conspiracy, and nobody's kind of telling us what's going on. When in reality, people are kind of getting a bit frustrated that public money is often being spent going nowhere, long periods of time, quite frustrating work, to be honest, I imagine, if you were actually trying to investigate UFOs. And I just think, we need to get real here. We're all looking to see where that boiling evidence is going to be, but so far we're still waiting, and it's over 70 years. So come on.
Absolutely, Colm. And if you consider the fact that, again, going back to the video clip, the Go Fast one, it was emitting radar, which to me suggests, it already had a level of radio capability technology. So, the likes of SETI and other programs that have been continuously looking in the radio spectrum, and they've found absolutely nothing. And they've been doing it for decades, and they found absolutely nothing. So it's not that the science, but to be clear, the likes of the SETI groups they're scientists, and they're not non-believers and they're not believers. They're coming at it purely eyes open. If it's there, it's there. If it isn't, it isn't. And so far, there's simply no evidence that it is there from a scientific community point of view.
Just for people who may not know, the SETI Institute, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So the Institute is there designed specifically for this. It is just to search the skies, looking for signals or looking for some kind of evidence for possible life out there. So it's not that there's this cover up to try to not look for it. Is that this institute is actually established specifically for that. That's their sole purpose out there. Unless there's something else they're doing I don't know of, but I'm pretty sure that's the only thing they're doing.
I mean, it's a Nobel Prize, right, for the people who discover it. It's like, I mean, there's a lot of and a lot of this, when we talk about even that kind of the technology being like, incredibly faster, new materials or something like that. That's like, not only maybe Nobel Prizes, but also potentially a lot of kind of business opportunities and stuff like that. If you've got something over everybody else, like this is really hard to keep a secret, right? This stuff leaks out because it's big money. It involves, huge, it changes the world. And again, I go back to the 70 years, it's.
Well, absolutely. Really, and I mean, and that's a very good point, Colm. I mean, in the modern era, right? It may be in the 40s through the 90s, it might have been easier to keep these kind of, we'll call them sightings, a bit more secret. But with the advent of this, it's nigh on impossible to keep anything a secret anymore. I mean, there's so much, no one can keep anything secret anymore practically. There's so many mobile phones and so many cameras out there and yet none of them are still coming back with concrete and scientific based evidence that it's a UFO. So
yeah,
I just saw this comment, sorry, it just popped up from John that said, two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying, and that's from Arthur C. Clarke. So we're actually just over the hour mark here. So I wanted to give you guys the last opportunity, and maybe Rob, you can say what you wanted to just say your final piece on this and say what it is you think, maybe you have a conclusion, what you think these objects are. I think we've established what we think, but your final thoughts on the video, your final thoughts on the UFOs, and I'll let you have your last say here. And if you want to start, go ahead, Rob.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing is, it's pretty obvious where we all stand on the most recent evidence for the phenomenon of UFOs, but that the broader philosophical questions that they bring up, I think people who are skeptical and people who believe actually have some shared feelings on that one. So, you know, while I don't personally believe that the most recent UFO sighting was an extraterrestrial, I would love for it to be, you know, and there is literally nothing that I would rather live to see in my lifetime than evidence for life somewhere else. If it is a slime mold on the surface of Titan, I will be ecstatic. Like, what more humbling thing could there be than to discover life elsewhere? And I just don't see the motivation anyone could have for not wanting to find that. I believe all four of us here, you know, would love to see that there is life elsewhere in the universe. So I don't think there is a motivation to disbelieve. I think we just have to go with our heads rather than our hearts and not see what we want to see here. So sadly, no, I don't think the recent Pentagon videos did show aliens.
You're not convinced. All right. Colm, do you want to give your perspective? Your final say?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much the same as Rob. I just don't think the evidence is good enough. You know, it's going to take a little bit more. It's going to need to be a bit more specific. It's going to need a little bit more. And really, what's being asked of here is just give us enough evidence so that, you know, people can actually start researching this properly and start to establish what the ground rules are. And trying to start going down the route of conspiracy every single time is not necessarily going to move us forward. And great for there to be enthusiasm and everything, but it's not always the answer, and there needs to be a lot of hard work done. And in the meantime, there's loads of other stuff that we can be looking at. We can be investigating more clearly, and spending lots of time on something that could be just a phenomenon, you know, like ghosts or like, you know, apparitions or something like that is not really the best use of time. That's where the hypothesis is at the moment for a lot of people.
Oh, and Alan, what's your last thought here?
It's not going to be too dissimilar to the rest of you folks, but the reality is, from a physics point of view, the likelihood of interstellar travel is extremely difficult. It's theoretically possible. I mean, the Voyager is already doing interstellar travel, and we have the Planetary Society Light Sail mission, which is planning to move into interstellar space as well. So so there are a number of projects about going into interstellar space from a human point of view, but they're all obviously small craft. There's no humans on them, and they're not going to get to any particular other planetary system in any near time. So and I think if you reverse that process, if you think of the reciprocal of that, the likelihood of other craft coming here, it's, from a physics point of view, it's extremely difficult to do that. I think the videos themselves from the Pentagon, I think, can be readily explained using terrestrial and human-made objects. I don't think there's any question about that. I do think, like Rob and Colm and yourself, that there is likely to be life in the universe elsewhere. The nature and form of that, however, is completely to be determined. We have no idea whether it's going to be all microbial, or whether it's going to be human-like, or whether it's going to be octopus-like, or who knows what it's going to be like. I do think it exists, but for me, it's exciting. It would be exciting to find it, and I think in our lifetime, I think it's likely that we will find habitable planets for sure, outside of our own solar system, and possibly even life within our own solar system in some kind of microbial, even if it's not live, it could be deceased. But I think we might find that within our own solar system in the next maybe 25 to 50 years. I think it's going to be that type of time span, personally. But I'm excited to do all of the above. And, you know, as an astrophysicist and someone who, you know, uses telescopes to look at light from extrasolar planets, I can't wait to get involved.
Yeah, I think I'll do my real short analysis here. I also share the same sentiment you all do as well about the tapes themselves. There was a comment specifically geared towards me earlier asking about communications, and it's interesting because that is the thing that I think about most, is how would you communicate with this? And we talked about a little bit about this earlier, but having a language background and seeing the different ways that we even just communicate here on Earth amongst our own selves, being able to communicate with something that's not from this planet, I think is a very interesting, complex idea. And it has a lot to do with the Voyager missions and what they had actually sent on there. I feel like we could do an entire video, an entire live stream just on the communication of other life forms, or even just what's out there in the universe. But I think that this was a very interesting topic. I think we could keep going on about it. There's so much more to unpack here. And it had a lot of, we had so many questions. We didn't get to everybody. But I did want to just thank you all for joining us for today. And thank you very much to Alan and Rob, of course. And a big thank you to Cullum for taking time out of your day to join us here for the live stream. It was your first time doing a live stream, right, Cullum?
Yes.
Did you enjoy it?
I hope so. We'll see the comments later.
Yeah, it was great having you. Thank you so much for doing this. And if we didn't get to your questions, if you do have a question later on that you really just want answered, you can go ahead and put it in the comment section under this video once the live stream has finished. So if you want more information, you can head over to our website at bco.ie. We've got some events coming up for the International Day of Light, so you can go over and check those out as well. And we will be doing other live streams. So make sure that you subscribe to our channel. That way you get notified the next time we have something coming up, and when we release new videos as well. So thanks everyone on the panel for being here today talking about this topic. It was a lot of fun. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and we'll talk to you all very soon. Bye.
Bye.